Welcome to the Gay Buddhist Forum, where teachers from all schools of Buddhism offer their perspectives on the Dharma and its application in modern times, especially for LGBTQI audiences. These talks are offered freely to the world and made possible by appreciative listeners. If you would like to support our efforts to share the Dharma with underserved audiences, please visit gaybuddhist.org. There you can donate, find a list of upcoming speakers, or enjoy many hundreds of these recorded talks dating back to 1996.
Professor of Religion and Professor of Buddhist Studies at Institute University. He's going to talk with us today. And I'm not sure what his plan is, but he'll let him talk
about it. All right. Okay, I was asked to speak about the panel that I was on. I have how much time?
About 45 minutes.
45 minutes. And does that include also time for questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so I shouldn't take the whole 45 then. I should take not more than half an hour. As David said in his introduction, I'm Professor of Religion at Duke University. Some people already know me quite well. I feel that I live in San Francisco, but my stuff is back east. Within a few years, I'm hoping to remedy that and get an early retirement from Duke and then move out here. And I tend to be the professor who is involved in a professor of Buddhist studies who is involved in the Gay Buddhist Fellowship and also reports on you or us. So a couple of articles are in press and in production to make Gay Buddhist Fellowship famous around the world. And then, of course, if you read about that, you'll know what you're doing, because you need professors to interpret you. It was also I also brought up the idea at one time. I think I might not have been the person who started it, that there should be a regular feature that I might do in the newsletter called Ask the Dharma Daddy, but it has not yet been decided to do that. So I was in San Francisco this time for the annual meeting of the American Academy of Religion, which is the main it's the main professional meeting of teachers in religion in universities in the USA. It's one of these big monster things. This is the program of the sessions. So you see a lot of things are happening at the same time. For a few years now, we've had a group. There's a roundtable consultation group and section. I won't go into all those differences, but the group is called Gay Men's Issues in Religion group, and we have been able to get 2 sessions on the program for the last few years. We don't always meet, of course, in San Francisco, so you can't go to it every year. It's been meeting on the weekend before Thanksgiving for a long time, but it meets in different cities, and we're going for the first time that I know next year to Orlando. So I don't know what we'll do with Disney. Yes. I have to tell this little vignette. I was in the city for the Gay Pride Day last year, and on the day before Gay Pride Day, for some reason, the lesbians want to have their own procession, and I saw a bit of that going down Market Street, and on the side, on the curb, were 3 or 4 women who were wearing Mickey Mouse hats, with the ears, and they were holding a sign saying, "Baptists repent." So, what it was suggested I would do by Lee was to give a summary of the papers that we had at the panel, and then we'll open it up for questions, and then I believe some people might go to lunch afterwards, and I would be available to talk more. I'm leaving tomorrow morning, so if you want to ask me a question, this is the time. There were supposed to be 5 papers, but only 4 were given. One of the presenters was sick. The first was by Leonard or Lenny Zwilling, who is, I would say, he's the leading scholar in interpreting the Pali and early Sanskrit texts in regard to homosexuality in both the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition. Then I had my paper, which I'll spend the most time on that, summarizing that, and then by Michael Sweet, who I believe he gave the talk last Sunday. Yes, so he gave the talk here last time. So if you were here last time, you heard his talk, so I won't need to go into much about that. Michael Sweet has been doing very similar things to Lenny, and they have been partners for, well, forever. I don't know how long, but anyhow, they go together. So it isn't surprising to see them on the same panel. And then a paper by Jose Cabezon, whom many of you may have known from the response to the Dalai Lama. He was a monk of the Tibetan tradition for some time. We used to call him Lama Jose, because I forget what his Tibetan name was, and he gave back his vows and has been a layperson for some time, and is on the staff, the faculty of the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, and has also been a leading scholar more in the area of sexuality and gender in general, more than the specific textual work. Though actually he is doing some textual work. I didn't have time to ask him about this because things went through rather quickly, but as many of you know, when the Dalai Lama was here, he was asked what did he mean when he said it was against the Buddhist tradition to have sex between two persons of the same sex, or to use the hand or mouth or anus, which pretty well gets rid of most people. But he said there was a text, and he didn't quite know where the text is. According to Jose, it is something from the Lamrim Chenmo of Dzongaba, in which he quotes Ashwagosha, and Jose is trying to find precisely where that is. So I can't give you any more details than that at the moment, but I would say that from within the Buddhist tradition, this is simply a textual issue that needs to be investigated, and is certainly not something that is really obvious to all Buddhists. So it's there somewhere, and what it means we still have to find out. So you shouldn't be too worried about that, I think, is the point. So the first paper by Leonard Zwilling, the title was To Mock as Unmanly, and then the colon. You know that all academic titles have to have a colon, or the contents are not able to be digested. The Pali verb opandito and its senses. If you're a professional in this field, you would immediately know what the problem is. Without being a professional, it will not be clear what the problem is. The verb opandito, which also forms a Pali and Sanskrit word, pandaka, is important in the discussion of homosexuality and Buddhism. I suppose it was clear, maybe it wasn't clear, that the entire panel was called Buddhism from Gay Perspectives. So that's why I'm summarizing all the papers. In the lists of sexual things that you shouldn't do, which are much more in the forefront of the Buddhist tradition than this rather obscure reference from Ashvaghosha, which the Dalai Lama referred to, it is frequently said that one should not have sex with a pandaka. This is in the context, of course, of not having sex in the presence of the guru or the picture of the guru, or more than 6 times a night, and in the daylight or in the open air. I mean, they're not. It's unclear to me why there are these things in the lists, but they are very common. So who's a pandaka? And then also it appears that if one is identified as being one of these entities, one is not supposed to become a monk. It's apparently a male thing, so it doesn't refer to women becoming nuns. Attempts to translate this have normally translated it as either a eunuch or a homosexual, and that's why we think, well, what is it going on here? He did. So Lenny did some. He has published on this already in the book edited by Jose Cabezon called Buddhism, Sexuality and Gender, which was published by SUNY Press some years ago, and that is, I think, still the primary source for looking into this topic. There are 3 essays, I think, on Buddhism and homosexuality in that. And in that article, he tried to figure out what Pandaka meant from its context, and it seemed to mean someone with obviously a male with some kind of sexual dysfunction or another, somehow not entirely a man, and not especially a homosexual, but someone who could only have an orgasm under certain special circumstances, such as he had to watch others doing it, or it had to be in a certain position or something. And generally the context seemed to be somebody who was not really, as we'd say, macho today, and he found that it also could be applied by extension to women. And he suggested that a translation to English would be someone who has no balls, which you can say even of a woman. You can say she doesn't have the balls to do that, and so the suggestion was it was kind of an attitude more than anything else. All of this should make us very cautious, you see, about trying to say that the Buddhist tradition is for or against anything like a gay lifestyle like we know today. The suggestion, I would say, is that it has nothing really to say about that, and we're trying to look at it as something new, trying to look between the lines. So in this paper, so Lenny goes beyond that. He assumes that we've read his previous article, and Opandito, he said it can be used as an insult, and he came up with a number of instances where a person was insulted as this. Some of the instances he found were rather odd, where one bhikkhu was sick, and the physician comes and looks at him, and he has the Buddha come, and he has to look at his anus. He says, "Look at his anus," and the Buddha says, "You're a pandaka," for asking me to do that. I think anybody who thinks religion is boring has not looked at all of the stories. So, to cut to the chase with all of this, he feels that it was something like calling a person a queer or a faggot, in the bad sense of a queer or a faggot, because now, of course, we're trying to restore the word queer to some kind of nobility, but an insult in that kind of way, something about their sexuality which is non-standard. So then, let me go on to the one by Michael Sweet, which I don't need to go into too much detail, because if you were here last week, you heard it. But he was trying to say there that the stories of the present and the former lives of the disciple Ananda. The disciple Ananda is extremely well known in the Buddhist tradition. He was the closest person to the Buddha, the body servant or the valet, and extremely devoted to him. And he wept when the Buddha was about to die, and is sometimes compared to Saint John in the Gospels for the Christian tradition. And was asking whether or not we could see Ananda as the queer ancestor. And I would say that he brought out a fair amount of evidence that there was a homoerotic element in the stories of Ananda in this life and the previous life. But this doesn't necessarily mean that there was anything sexual going on, particularly in Indian culture, which if any of you have been to India, you will see that affection between men is fairly common and is not regarded as sexual or as at all odd. In fact, what is regarded as obscene in public is affection between the sexes. I once did see a man and a woman embrace, and they were in a park in New Delhi, and they thought they were not being observed, and when they saw me they broke immediately. But then you would see men walking down the street holding fingers or hands. They hold little fingers. Once again, I think we cannot make a definite association with what's happening today and what the texts have to show us. Then the paper by by Jose. He gave it an odd title, I thought. Buddhism and HIV/AIDS, once again, of course, a colon, a theological response. What he means by theological response is a Buddhist a response from a Buddhist normative perspective. That's to say, how, not as an academic studying Buddhism at a distance, but how as an academic who understands the Buddhist tradition and the texts and is also involved in it, because he is a practitioner of it, how would one respond to that, also in the fact that he's also out, and he could be HIV positive. He said that he wrote the paper while he was awaiting for the results of his test, and then at the end of the paper, the test came back and he was negative still. So then he felt, well, should I have written it, because it must be different if you're positive or if you're negative. But he proposed that, and he proposed it with some diffidence, but he proposed it that there might be some advantage in using a visualization technique if one is negative, HIV negative, a visualization technique to presume that one is positive, and to use it as a way of meditating on impermanence and death. He said that some people feel apparently so guilty that they go ahead and expose themselves to risk in order to convert, so that they feel, well, they're like everybody else now, or everybody else that they know. And he feels that would be really being harmful to oneself and would be against the Buddhist precepts. He also tried to ask whether or not HIV is a living being, because we don't stop, of course, at humans in the Buddhist tradition, and whether it would be right to kill it. And sort of seemed to me to come down, and Lee may have. Lee, who was also, and David, you were also at the session, may remember it slightly differently, seemed to come down on the side of saying, well, yes, it is, but we have compassion for it and also ourselves, and somehow we have to balance this off. I think it's a much larger issue, actually, because we're all going to get a cold or something like that. We're all going to get sick in some way, and then what is happening is we're being infected by other beings, and also just to digest we have this, and what stance do we take up about this? In general, the Buddhist tradition is concerned with being compassionate to all beings, but realizing it's impossible not to kill in order to live, even if one is a vegetarian. Well, let me come on to my paper and give a little bit more, maybe the same amount of time to that. I was trying to do. I have a handout, of course. That's another thing professors do. You see, these are, yes, okay. Maybe I could just. Could you pass off half this way and half that way? This is the outline which I used. If you were at the conference, you used the same one. And speaking from an outline means I don't have to go into great detail, because you can get. I will also leave with you, with the whoever's in charge here, We never like to say that anyone is in charge of GBF, but whoever would prefer to say they were in charge, I will leave a copy of the entire paper. It is a conference draft, so please don't quote it as official yet. We may possibly put them together with some other texts to make a book out of them. So I was here over the summer doing some basic field work of Buddhist responses to HIV in the Bay Area, and in fact I almost decided at one point to retitle my paper, which doesn't have a colon, you see, as Buddhist response to HIV in the San Francisco Bay Area, because that's where the field work is. But then actually the intent of the paper is to be broader than that, and to put what is happening in a detailed way in the Bay Area, as long as not much I've been able to find out about it, in the broader context of Buddhist responses to disease in general and HIV in particular. I start by reminding us, if you're a practitioner of the Buddhist tradition, you will not need any reminder about this, that it is not un-Buddhist to be concerned with one's health. One shouldn't be simply concerned with one's spiritual aspect and neglect one's health. It is true that the gift of the Dharma, the gift of the teaching, is the best of the teachings, but then if one is in extreme physical or mental suffering of some sort, the gift of the Dharma is really irrelevant. The first order of business is to act as much as one is able to make a person physically healthy and have enough food and shelter and so forth, so that they have the leisure to think about the root cause of all the suffering. Those are called the gift of the Dharma is called the Lokuttara, or trans-worldly, literally I call it extra-samsaric gift, and one's health is the this-worldly, or the Laukika, or intra-samsaric gift. And this would be the way that one would approach health and HIV particularly. My research was concentrated on the gay community in the USA and San Francisco, because that's where the HIV started off in the USA, in the West, I suppose, and of course was, because of that, concluded at first to be a gay disease, which of course we know now is nonsense. And then, because of all the Buddhists in this area, look at them all sitting around, we then had a Buddhist response to all of this. So I then speak in the models of wellness of the difference between the way that institutional Western medicine on the whole looks at illness and health. We sometimes do not realize that there are very firm metaphysical presuppositions to all of that, and they're so obvious, they're so part of our culture, we miss them out. There are some books which have exposed all of that, which I give you, which are there's a reference to in the footnotes to the full paper. But in essence, it's the Cartesian split between the subject and the object, so that you go into the doctor as the patient, the passive one, if you understand me, the one that is to have things to be done to, and you are diseased, so the focus is on the disease and on the technique to try to fix you. This works with certain things such as a broken leg, or a hernia or something. This is a very effective way. With other things which are more of a syndrome, like addiction or HIV, it is not as effective because the whole person and their situation must be taken into account. The West is not unaware of this and has now, because of problems in the Cartesian approach, has developed something called mind-body medicine. It was started off in Harvard, and we now have something going at Duke in this. And in the paper I have an interview with Larry Burke, who is a specialist in a mind-body medicine program at Duke. And then this sees, the mind-body medicine technique sees the person in their bio-psycho-spiritual context. The hospice movement is a part of the same kind of thing, though not directly linked with the mind-body medicine movement, but they resonate with each other. And what I got from my interviews with hospice caretakers was particularly that they said, we don't give treatment, but we give comfort care. And we see death not as a failure, but as a part of life. Since, as Jim Morrison said, no one gets out of here alive. And although Mr. Mojo Rising tried to come back, he apparently hasn't made it yet. So we all have to face up to it at some time or another. The difference, of course, with something like HIV is that often we have to face up to it at an earlier age than we would. When you get to be my age, you begin thinking, perhaps it won't be too long. So so the approaches from the Buddhist tradition are very similar to that of the mind-body medicine approach, but it is also more ancient. It's part of the four requisites. The monk or nun is said to be supplied by the layperson with the four requisites, the four things that we need to function within this samsaric existence, which are food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. Food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. So medicine is right in there, in the earliest tradition that we know of. My undergraduate students at Duke University are somewhat puzzled that sex is not one of the requisites, but I say it is possible to live without it. And they make a note of that. Then there is the theory or law or teaching of the fruiting of karma. And some months or so back, a year or so back, I did a short article on karma for the GBF newsletter. It was only a certain amount of space, so I had to contract it. But what I was trying to say was the popular notion that karma is fate, that it's just one of those things we have to put, it's my karma, what can I do, is actually a serious misunderstanding of the Buddhist teaching. The Buddhist teaching is, yes, whatever happens to me is the fruiting of my previous karma, but the fruiting of karma is only seldom so demanding and so oppressive that I have no way to maneuver. I have no way to respond to this, and I have no way to act in a positive or skillful way so that the fruiting of karma in the future will be more favorable. In general, we find that in most situations I do have some freedom of movement, and I can at least respond to the fruiting of karma in a skillful way so that it doesn't make me feel so miserable, and then I can start a skillful practice so that sometime in the future, maybe not in this life, but sometime in the future, I will be able to, I will have a more fortunate existence. So we can rephrase or reframe a karma as opportunity rather than fate. And towards the end of the paper, I do instance a bhikkhu from Thailand who is specifically trying to do that, specifically trying to emphasize some texts such as the Mangala Sutta, the Sutta on fortunate consequences, to rephrase Buddhism from the more fatalistic aspect of ordinary Buddhism into a more forward-looking thing, saying everything that happens to me is an opportunity for me to learn or progress in some way. If somebody cuts into you on the highway, cuts you off on the highway, what an opportunity to learn patience and compassion. How kind of them to do that. Yes, you know that one? Okay. So also, apart from, within the Buddhist tradition then, some kind of medical practice is normal. And in general, they would use, the bhikkhus would use some kind of what we tend to call folk medicine, acupuncture or herbal remedies or something. In the Tibetan tradition, however, a very sophisticated synthesis of folk medicine, Tibetan folk medicine, Chinese folk medicine, the Ayurvedic medicine from the Hindu tradition, and also an approach from the Buddhist tradition have been blended together, and one can go to a Tibetan physician with some certainty that you're not getting just a quack, that you're getting something rather sophisticated. And there is a Dr. Dicky Nirongsha, who she has a practice in Denver and also San Francisco, who has been treating HIV patients and has had remarkable success with at least one person in which a lymphoma of the rather aggressive type actually disappeared. So that got the Western doctor very excited. I don't want to. You can see something about the main ideas of it here. I don't want to go on much longer because I want to finish off and leave some time for questions. As for the field work, quite a lot of that you will all know something about that. So Steve Peskin is not here this morning. I didn't in fact let him know I'd be talking here. I think I tried to get around to it, but somehow didn't. He, of course, started the Buddhist AIDS project when he was down in Los Angeles and brought it here to San Francisco, and it remains, as far as I can see, the major resource network for the area. There is also the Buddhist AIDS network, which is in New York, at least it's on the website there. Pat O'Hara is a Zen priest or priestess in New York, and is also heavily involved in the AIDS work. I had heard her name, and then I came across her in an information tent at the Quilt in Washington, D.C. last year, and we got to know each other a little bit more from that, and we're getting to know each other a little bit more, I think, because we're working together on the AIDS National Interfaith Network is putting together a big conference on AIDS and religion in the USA at the Carter Center in Atlanta next November, and I'm somehow involved in that with her. So then also hospices, I found out first that one has to understand first about the visiting nurses in hospice of San Francisco, which started off before there was anything like AIDS recognized, and I managed to interview a nurse who was all the way over in Highland Hospital in Oakland, and I got to that by public transport, and I think I deserve some kind of acclamation for that. AC Transit. Then it seems that there was some spiritual aspect, and there was a Buddhist input. Certainly, the nurse I talked to at Highlands was a practitioner of Buddhism, and she wore the wrist rosary, which is the giveaway. See, and she said she was also. Then the three hospices that I looked at and I interviewed in San Francisco, and the interviews, of course, are in more detail in the paper. Zen Hospice, linked with the Zen Center, was the most Buddhist of the centers, and they emphasized that they were primarily a hospice for giving comfort care to the dying, and only for AIDS as a secondary thing, and therefore we're moving away from care for AIDS as the syndrome is changing with the new protocols, and people are just not dying as much, thank goodness, from that. My tree, which has just moved, and I haven't had a chance yet, I hope maybe this afternoon, to go and look over at the new place to Bose. It was still part of Hartford Street Zen Center at the time. This, on the other hand, was slightly less Buddhist, despite its connection with the Zen Center, but that is being, of course, especially with the move, the connection with Zen Center is getting to be less, but there is still some kind of emphasis on meditation and the spiritual life for those who would like it. And they are principally, they said, for AIDS, and only then they aren't a hospice as much as they used to be. In fact, they did change their name, so it doesn't say hospice anymore. It's got, I forget exactly the whole title of it, but they've changed the name a bit, so it's for long-term or intermittent care for people who might have some kind of opportunistic infection, and then they go back, then they get or healthy again, and they go back into their home. Then, as a control, I went to the Coming Home Hospice, thinking this would be very different because it's not Buddhist at all. In fact, the nurses there, the couple I talked to, tended to be Catholic or something like Christian in some sense, but it was still very much the same feeling that there was a spiritual and a holistic approach. Then I came across two meditation groups in the city. Many of you will know George Gajewski. I asked if he was going to come to this talk this morning, and he said no. He's going to the session in Green Gulch. But he has been operating an HIV positive sort of zazen. He says it's a secular session at Hartford Street Zen Center, which is made a bit more relaxed in both doctrine and physical things, so that it would be more appropriate to persons who have some problem sitting for a long time or getting up in the early morning. And then I've been a couple of times to the Friday evening sessions of the Living Peace Meditation community run by Karen Van Dyne, and she says that she is vaguely linked with Thich Nhat Hanh, but she has a kind of natural Buddhism, which she says simply arises when you get people together in a kind of occurring kind of way as a sangha. Then what she calls Buddhist compassion naturally arises from that. The part at the end on the situation in Asia I don't think I need to go into, and then on the other side you get a list of some of the resources. I've gone almost to the end of my time, but I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Regard to Jose's discussion on whether it's acceptable in a Buddhist tradition to kill HIV virus and other potentially sentient beings. In what he said about that, as I understood it was a very academic conceptualization, so fellow professor I could appreciate it, was that it was an organism of lower complexity, and the theory was that organisms of higher complexity had more of a possibility or potential for spiritual growth, and therefore if a choice had to be made, it was better that the organism of higher complexity persisted.
Sounds like a Christianity. What about Buddhist response to earlier plagues like bubonic and polio, or one or the other? Are there any parallels to HIV? That might be opposed to?
No, not that I know of. I think that you might brought up an important point there, is that in a sense something like this might be part of what we now are calling engaged Buddhism. Some people would say that engaged Buddhism with a social aspect is as old as the Buddhist tradition. And that's certainly the position of Ken Jones and so forth. I think that it's somewhat iffy, that if there is involvement, it is pretty minimal. I think it's much more typical of the Buddhist tradition that I was at a conference in Switzerland on Buddhist-Christian dialogue, and the Geshe, the Lama, who was the head of the Tibetan Institute at Rikon in the German-speaking part of Switzerland, put it this way, and I think this is a very typical way. He says, we had a meeting of Geshes in which we discussed, amongst other things, compassion. And we said, in the Buddhist tradition, we have these wonderful visualizations of compassion to all living beings. And we try to put out feelings of compassion and be compassionate to all we meet. The Christians, however, are trying to change the world. Why don't we do something like that? So I think that's one of the most important fruits of the interaction of the Buddhist and Christian tradition, which is something I could talk about a long time also, that when the Buddhists meet the Christians, they say, hey, the Christians are doing this compassion they're actively being compassionate. We in the Buddhist tradition speak of compassion, but we don't really try to change the world, so we don't address these kinds of social issues. On the other hand, you see, when the Christians meet the Buddhists, they say, oh, the Buddhists are sitting and then meditating. I think we have that in the Christian tradition, but we forgot about it. Maybe we should meditate more.
Just wanted to say that I don't know if you've discovered this in your work so far on this particular paper. What I've seen over time, I started doing hospice work about 20 years ago. There were people who were Buddhist practitioners at that time But they just run the classes. So there's always been Buddhists. I mean, maybe I don't know always, but in America anyway, or in California, there've been a lot of Buddhist practitioners who've been doing hospice work for at least 20 to 30 years. And I know right now, for instance, there's a Buddhist hospice that's forming. It's been forming in Santa Cruz, and I'm on a board. And it's an inner Sangha project. So I mean, I think it's, and there's other ones. I understand there's some in England. And I'm not sure of all of them. So I think the organizational part of it's happening now, as distinct from just talking about it.
I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that, because I'm sure that if I do revise this for publication, I will need to expand the database. But the nurse I talked to in over in Oakland, and she was called Deborah or something. I can find her name if you like. Specifically said this, that she was interested in Asian stuff when she was a student at Cal, and she went over to Asia, and she sort of got involved in Buddhism, but she was also a nurse, and she came back and she found that there was AIDS happening, and what could she do, you see. So from a very early time, I think there's been some input, at least in the Bay Area, in that. But what I found in the Coming Home Hospice, that it was more, well, even with that, in the Coming Home Hospice, the first meeting had Steve Peskind was at the organizational meeting thinking about it, but he says it wasn't a Buddhist meeting because there were Hindus and rabbis and whatever, you see. So.
Thank you for listening to the Gay Buddhist Forum. If you would like to hear several new talks per month and be notified of upcoming speakers so you can participate live, please subscribe to this podcast, like us on Facebook, and join our mailing list by visiting gaybuddhist.org.